You, my guardian angel, take my soul of fire. In this game, we're double agents.
You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the deeper messages, symbols, and predictive programming subtext that underlie modern film. In this show, we will be interviewing artists, experts, and numerous people in media fields. And this will all be based on my years of research in comparative religion, propaganda, psychological warfare, secret societies, and espionage. Esoteric Hollywood decodes the biggest movies in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with completely new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. The intro song you heard was Dream Agent by Ariel, Electron, Thierry, Gotti, and Holeg Spies on the Kosmou album. Esoteric Hollywood. I'm Jay Dyer of JaysAnalysis.com, and tonight we have no stranger to Jay's Analysis, but the first time on Esoteric Hollywood will be half of the Collins brothers, Paul Collins. Paul, how are you tonight?
Hey, not too bad, Jason.
All right. Well, we've had a lot of great conversations in the past, and I think last time was about maybe a year ago we spoke about feminism, and that was a great conversation. I think it had a few thousand views on YouTube, which is pretty good for a chat of that length. We went for about 3 hours, and tonight we're going to get into some new topics and a little bit of what we discussed in the past. Since we talked, you guys have been working on a book. Your book is going to be, of course, Invoking the Beyond. And what's happened since we talked about a year ago?
Well, when we last spoke, the book was sitting somewhere around 100 and some odd pages. The book is now at 372 pages.
Wow.
The section over the UFOs is starting to finally come to a close. There's just a few more issues, a few more items that we want to hit on in that section. I'm wrapping up a portion of it over Jonestown. Most people don't realize this, but there were exotheological trappings to Jim Jones's theology, and most people don't realize also that there is a considerable amount of evidence that Jones was either wittingly or unwittingly an asset of the intelligence, of the intelligence community, the realm of intelligence.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, I kind of wish that James Kelly had gone into more of that when he and I did some interviews, but that is a crucial angle on this that I think you guys are correct about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just, that rabbit hole, you can follow it it goes very, very deep. From his earliest days in Indianapolis, in Richmond, where he meets this police officer, Dan Mitrione. Mm-hmm. Dan Mitrione, of course, went on to work in interrogation and I believe it was the CIA. And went to a training school for interrogation, was an instructor at that school, ended up being assassinated over in Central America, but there was an overlap in the time between when he was in Brazil and when Jim Jones was in Brazil, and some people think that the U.S. consulate car that was outside of the Jones house was actually sent by Dan Mitrione, was the Mitrione's family. And there's an autobiography, portions of an autobiography that was found at Jonestown, where he writes and Jones admits that he knew Mitrione, and he seems to try to place distance between him and Mitrione and all, but it's undeniable from reading the portions of that autobiography, that he met Mitrione, that he knew Mitrione, and there's all these other connections to the realm of intelligence running through Jonestown Right now, the section in the section I'm writing about the Leighton family, and the Leighton family included Lisa Leighton, her son and her daughter Deborah, and Larry Leighton. Larry Leighton was the only individual who was ever went to trial and was ever convicted as far as Jonestown goes. And he was part of the assassination squad that killed Leo Ryan on the airstrip at Kosmou and everything. But what most people don't know, I mean, Lisa Leighton looked like a temple defector. She looked like a temple defector, but in reality, she was probably playing a double agent. There were all sorts of double agents that were in the concerned relatives group that was pressuring Ryan to go to Jonestown, and it looks like that pressure was being exerted by these people to basically lure Ryan into a trap. Ryan was a pain in the you-know-what of the CIA. He had been instrumental in writing the Hughes-Ryan Act, and which would have which was putting up boundaries for the Central Intelligence Agency. He had called for Patty Hearst's sentence to be commuted and everything. He got the smell with the whole Patty Hearst abduction that was somehow connected to the intelligence community through Sinku, the head of the Symbionese Liberation Army. He had actually been a part of the Black Cultural Association when he was incarcerated in California, which was headed up by Colston Westbrook, a guy who had worked with the CIA, a linguist who had worked with the CIA, and had actually been part of the Phoenix assassination program in Vietnam.
Okay.
And some people think that maybe what Westbrook was doing was actually taking the whole Phoenix template and moving it from Vietnam and transposing it here.
Domestic,
yeah, exactly, and everything. So Ryan had just become a thorn in their side. He needed to go. And Leighton was one of the individuals that was pressuring him to go to travel to Jonestown. She was married to Lawrence Leighton, who had worked at Dugway Proving Ground, and there's of course an overlap between Dugway Proving Ground provides yet another overlap between the deep political world and the whole UFO lore, the whole UFO narrative, because Dugway Proving Ground is considered to be the quote unquote new Area 51.
Oh, there we go. Right. Yeah. That's where I was going to go next. I wanted to ask you. So, for new listeners, those that may be new to the work of the Collins brothers, which can be found at conspiracyarchive.com, tell us. You mentioned a term, exotheology. Tell us how exotheology might apply in this case to cults, dark side of the intelligence networks, and then Hollywood. So, to get into exotheology just a little bit.
Yeah, exotheology is basically the theology of space. It's basically transforming the notion of extraterrestrials and otherworldly beings and civilizations and their alleged visitation of Earth, transforming all that into a new repository for Messianism, for religion, and that's what it appears that the intelligence community has done. Mm-hmm. They have. We present just a ton of evidence in the new book. We're presenting a ton of evidence in the new book that they have presented two different types of aliens to us, two different portraits of aliens that one would be considered to be benevolent, space brothers, that supposedly sent like messiahs and avatars such as Jesus or Buddha or whatnot to Earth to help in our evolutionary development, and then malevolent aliens that have come to basically take over the planet, to harvest us as a slave race. Both of these portraits, they have the same ends. The same
Right.
ends they are basically the beyond. They are something that has been presented to mankind that basically dwarfs us epistemologically. Our epistemological spectrum has just been overshadowed by this, and so new models of governance must be introduced, new ways of thinking must be introduced, new arrangements, societal arrangements have to be introduced to deal with this thing that just leaves us epistemologically dwarfed and everything. Whether we're talking about malevolent aliens or if we're talking about benevolent aliens, that seems that the answer is always that the nation-state system has to be jettisoned, and a world government system, a system of world government has to be introduced. You're either unifying to defeat this evil invasion from space, to prevent mankind's extinction or enslavement, or you have to pool your resources into a more centralized power structure and all to set up establish diplomatic relations with the aliens. In other words, who speaks for Earth? What's his name? Stanton Friedman used to always say that. Well, who speaks for Earth? Argentina? No. We have to have a world government that can send emissaries, that can send ambassadors to speak, to show that Earth speaks as one mind to them.
Starting to sound a little bit like Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. It's starting to sound like fiction stories, not like anything substantial.
Absolutely. And Clarke's Childhood's End, by the way, is being produced into a sci-fi. I'm interested to see where it goes with where they go with that, because that's a very, very important little novel. I mean,
all right. Hold on a second. We're going to take a break here, and we'll be back. We're talking exotheology with the Collins brothers of ConspiracyArchive.com. Hollywood. We are talking with Paul Collins of the Collins brothers. Their works can be found at ConspiracyArchive.com. And we were just getting into the topic of their new book, which will be out very soon, called Invoking the Beyond. And what is Invoking the Beyond? Well, it deals with this topic of exotheology. And if you heard the last segment, Paul was telling us that exotheology really deals with space and the so-called theology of space. Now, how might that tie into UFOs and cults and dark intelligence networks? Well, because it can be engineered. And we brought up the topic of Childhood's End. Paul, continue with what you're saying about religious engineering through exotheology.
Right. And you wanted me to bring in the whole aspect of the motion pictures industry and everything. The motion pictures industry has had a long relationship with the realm of intelligence.
Yes.
And we see several motion pictures that have narratives that correspond with the UFO disinformation that's out there. And it's obvious that the motion pictures industry is busy at work putting together this new repository for the human spiritual experience, for Messianism, for religion, and all in the form of UFO movies, of alien related movies. And I'll give you just one example right off speaking extemporaneously, right off the top of my head. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the First Kind.
Yes.
You look at that movie, and it's obvious that the main character is supposed to be kind of this Saint Paul that has this road he's on the road to Damascus.
Yes.
He has this road to Damascus like experience. At the end of the movie, it's like when the aliens come down on the mountain, it's obvious that he knew this had resonance with us. Spielberg knew he had resonance with it. This had resonance.
Well, it's almost like Mount Sinai. It's a sign.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
That's what I was going to say. It was Mount Sinai. Well, when they come down to I believe it's Devil's Mountain.
Yes.
It's really close to where I live.
Oh, wow.
And everything. But when they come down, recall there was an exchange program. There was an exchange program, and here these, Dreyfus joins this group and everything, and he's going up, in this scene that's supposed to closely mirror kind of the ascension, either Christ's ascension or
some sort of rapture.
Yeah, exactly. Or just like the prophet in the Old Testament in the chariot, the chariot. That whole exchange program we also see in well-known. It parallels an exchange program that was put out in a piece of UFO disinformation on the internet known as the Serpo files. And Serpo was supposedly this planet that's a little bit smaller than Earth. It has 2 suns. It's a dry, arid climate. It's really, really nasty and hot, but it is inhabitable. And the civilization of Serpo visits Earth and has this exchange program, and this away team leaves Earth and goes to Serpo and everything. Well, that information was passed to Victor Martinez, who was running this email group, that over UFOs that was frequented by people in the intelligence community. And he received all the Serpo information. He put it up online. You can go there, today and see the stuff. And it included this exchange that people were just like, oh my God, this exchange program, it parallels perfectly with Close Encounters of the First Time. Spielberg must know something. We've been handed the truth and all. Well, what they don't realize is that an individual by the name of Stephen Broadbent, he was a computer network specialist. He was able to actually look at the emails and everything concerning Serpo, the emails of this guy known as Requested Anonymous, who had sent the Serpo material, and he was able to trace it all to all the information from all these the whistleblowers and from Anonymous to the same consumer broadband IP address and everything, which was based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and all the home of Richard, the place out of which Richard Doty, a former AFOSI officer, was operating. And Richard Doty had appeared under his real name on the Serpo, site and everything, corroborating what all the Serpo material and everything. And prior to all this, Richard Doty had been part of a group that had been known as the Aviary. The Aviary put out most of the disinformation that we know today about Jesus Christ being an extraterrestrial.
This is a very common theme. I was at a conference recently, and I saw books devoted to that topic by certain authors who promote the alien mythos, and that's exactly what that brings to mind. As well as you can go on YouTube and type in this baloney, and you'll see probably, I mean, how many, 4-star general reveals that he was taken to Mars, and
Right.
I mean, it's just endless baloney. But what I like about what you're talking about is that you guys have kind of tracked down sort of the archetypal patterns of where this comes from. Like, this guy was the first one to really put out this mythology in some chat group or whatever that, it just happens to sound like a fictional movie.
Right. Doty also was a consultant on the X-Files and actually wrote 2 X-File episodes that were mythology episodes. I think it was Anasazi and Paperclip he wrote.
Oh, wow.
And everything. And if you look at the X-Files, it continues to put out a lot of the narrative, that runs right along parallel with the UFO disinformation campaign that we see emanating from the intelligence community. So these are just 2 examples of how the motion picture industry and the entertainment industry have gone hand in hand with the darker side of the world of intelligence in constructing this UFO alien narrative that is supposed to help supplant traditional religion, the Christian outlook, with a new spirituality that just makes it easier for the powers to be to control humanity.
Let me ask you this. I think it was, I'm not a big fan of this person. Well, Jan Irvin, but he had a great point. He had a great point in I think it was one of his interviews, but he was talking about the history of War of the Worlds and H.G. Wells and all this kind of stuff. And he was talking about how it's possible that back, say, in the 40s and 50s, when you really started seeing the rise of pulp science fiction and fantastic Fantastic Stories magazine, these different things that, say, Asimov would write for, that could have been kind of prepping at the time of World War II or for future geopolitical threats. In other words, that the science fiction could have been used to sort of put into the minds of the populace just the fear of xenophobia, the fear of the external threat, the fear of what's out there, and kind of get people ready for whatever the next war might be it World War II and then subsequent wars. But do you think that, and one of the reasons I think that there's something to that is I've been rewatching a lot of the old Twilight Zone episodes, and I noticed it's not every one of them, but in quite a few of them you can find at the end it'll say written in consultation with the Department of Defense.
Right.
And what I'm starting to wonder is if a lot of these alien episodes and so forth, and many of them are alien episodes, if they weren't being seeded, even back then in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. And I also think that they found ways to test the effectiveness of their seeding. And let me explain how. If you look at these early stories with alien narrative, alien invaders, with the whole alien invasion scenario being presented, they usually presented the aliens, their physical appearance was Asian, was very much Asian.
Exactly, right.
In nature. So when the American population was
Paul, hold that thought real quick, because We're going to take a break and we'll be right back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and we're talking with the Collins brothers in their book, Invoking the Beyond. Stay tuned. Hollywood. I'm talking to Paul Collins of the Collins Brothers and ConspiracyArchive.com. Their first book was Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. Their forthcoming book will be Invoking the Beyond. We're talking old sci-fi, 40s, 50s, 60s, and the tendency to sort of craft the narrative to where the alien invaders, the outside external threat, was at times, say, an Asian appearance. And could this preempt or be a sort of predictive preparation for the Cold War? Paul, finish your thought on that.
Yeah, sure. Like you said there, there was just scores of stories. I mean, you could go back to the Flash Gordon. Ming the Merciless looked like a Chinese. Yeah. I mean, very
Fu Manchu-ish, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and everything. The people of Mongo were, basically Asian and everything. But they would seed the population with these stories that with aliens that looked Asian in appearance. And so then when the American population was called upon to fight some kind of military campaign against an Asian population, whether it was Japan in World War II or Korea, the Koreans in the Korean War, or over in Vietnam and all, they were ready and gung-ho to do it, and actually looked upon their adversaries as something either less than human or just otherworldly and everything. They weren't human. Their enemies had been effectively dehumanized.
Yeah.
And everything. So because they had equated the aliens because aliens had been equated with the yellow peril, with people of Asian descent and all, the powers that be were able to effectively test the effectiveness of that propaganda on the people and everything. They saw that it could mobilize the people against the target and everything.
Well, let me ask you this. I think you're absolutely right. I wrote a piece that I think ties into what you're talking about, and I called it The Holy Church of St. Darwin's Space Brotherhood. And what I said was that, we can even go back to H.G. Wells, things to come, right? And as we move up into these different decades of the so-called luminaries of science fiction, be it Burroughs, Nolan, Heinlein, Asimov, even Frank Herbert, Arthur C. Clarke, you start seeing it kind of morph and meld into almost something that becomes religious. It goes from being pop, pulp, or maybe even H.G. Wells' Time Machine being maybe even children's books, right? And then as we get into the middle of the 20th century, it's pulp fiction, it's goofy, it's cheesy, but starts taking on the PsyOp operation of targeting external threats for geopolitical motives. And then I think, in my view, and I want to get your take on this, as we move up into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s, and into today, it's almost like science fiction is kind of merging with neo-Darwinism and the idea of evolution, and through the pop culture and the generations that are really just being raised on science fiction, it's almost taking on this new mythos.
Yeah, absolutely. It has developed and basically glommed on these different features as time has gone on. It's a developing. I think this is going along with what you're saying there. Jay, it's a developing evangelism.
Yeah,
and it's so as this evangelism has developed, and all the whole mythos has become a vehicle for different aspects of the power elite's agenda and everything. Part of that agenda is geopolitical in nature, and thus we see stories of the human race being mobilized to either to fight a malevolent alien force or to welcome, greet a benevolent alien force, or maybe even joining with benevolent aliens. This is a new take on it, variation ever since, at least since V, probably earlier.
I was thinking V, right?
Yeah, you're joining with benevolent lizards to fight the bad lizards, you know. So you know, it came to act as a vehicle for geopolitical aims and all. And now as we move forward, it also became a vehicle for Darwinism and for you know, just ideas that were supposed to supplant traditional Christianity, you know, in other words, so that the elite could introduce the new spiritual you know, experience.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that from the perspective of the elite, it really has nothing to do with really for altruistic motives, trying to, you know, solve some scientific dilemma of origins or trying to figure out what's really going on out there in the heavens. It's more so almost purely, I would say, about human control, herd management, social engineering. And so it's about creating and crafting stories that humans will believe and invest themselves into. And from their perspective, all religions are just that anyway, right? It's all syncretism. It's all just perennial philosophy of some sort or some flavor that just molds and develops over time. So why not latch onto that and write your own story?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's, you know, I couldn't put it better than that. I mean, their approach to religion is a pragmatic approach. It's all about pragmatism. It's about how do you fine tune this thing so as to direct people's behavior in a certain direction and everything. And I believe that one Rockefeller affiliated report over Darwinism, which you brought up, you know, said that Darwinism had. I'm talking, you know, speaking extemporaneously right now without it in front of me, and but one report from either the Rockefeller Foundation or a Rockefeller affiliated study group suggested that Darwinism had to be spread and it had to be disseminated on the mass level and everything for the purpose of quote unquote beneficent control.
Yes,
and everything, you know, and it. You know, Darwinism in itself is just a replacement theology. It's a replacement for our old religions, because it's kind of it's a Gnostic belief in self-salvation, that man is a you know, is a developing God. He's moving up from the slime to, you know, to a fish, you know, to a sea-dwelling creature. Then, you know, he loses his fins, develops bite, you know,
right.
You know,
and
legs, and slowly, gradually moving towards deity.
Well, that gradualism is crucial to tying it into the alien mythos, because the reason it fits so well with so-called space brothers or panspermia or something like this is because the idea is, well, since we just know that Earth is dogmatically 4.5 billion years old, or excuse me, that the solar system took 4.5 billion years to form, so-called, then it just stands to reason that over all these aeons, there would be somewhere other planets where life would have evolved and formed more quickly, and thus that's a more likely thesis as to origin science in terms of human anthropology. Yeah.
The way that I see that I see the marriage between Darwinism and the body of UFO lore is Darwinism had fallen into crisis because nature in all of creation demonstrates design. It displays design, and you know, you can't look at it and not describe it as something miraculous and as something that was, that has purposeful thought behind it and everything. Well, the Darwinists found themselves on the horns of a dilemma as this evidence became more and more, multitudinous and just obvious and in your face.
Right.
How do you deal with this? Well, Crick comes along and suggests, well, aliens seeded the planet, and that's why it shows design. So there you have, there all of a sudden.
Well, this is just a reintroduction of the gods. I mean, Darwinism was already based on, ancient Greek philosophy or even Egyptian philosophy relating to atomism and so forth. And then we thought we were enlightened and had moved past the gods. Well, now here come the gods back again. Yeah,
and so what Crick had done there is he had introduced he introduced an element that would just paralleled what had been passed on into the UFO community by forces within the intelligence community. I mean, because disinformation coming from the intelligence community in traveling into the UFO realm has always included this idea that aliens either created us or came along and intruded into our evolutionary development over time and tweaked things and guided it and directed it. I mean, Richard...
Hold that thought real quick because we're going to take a break. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood and we're talking to Paul Collins of conspiracyarchive.com. But tonight we're talking aliens, exotheology, UFO films, and propaganda, and then how it might tie into the Darwinian mythos that dominates our age. Paul, you were just talking about some of these myths and lies and their transmogrification and transmorphing transubstantiation over time as we watch Hollywood and fiction sort of travel alongside so-called science and so-called establishment academia. Finish your thought there.
Yeah. Again, what Crick was presenting when he said that the Earth had been seeded by an alien civilization, what he was presenting paralleled with disinformation that was inserted into the UFO community by individuals, again, like the likes of Richard Doty, this former Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent. He presented this when he was still with the AFOSI to Linda Moulton Howe. He gave her these documents, allowed her to read these documents that said that that basically stated that human evolution had been guided along by these otherworldly creatures, and that Jesus was actually created through genetic modification and all this sort of weirdness.
Here enters the Anunnaki and the DNA manipulation and creation of humans, and this myth that now I do think that Genesis 6 is talking about angelic entities, but I don't think that has anything to do with the co-opting of that story into modern intelligence stuff that you're talking about. But we see this everywhere. You go into a Barnes and Noble and you'll see 1,000 books about the Anunnaki DNA manipulating humans.
Right, absolutely, and now it's taken on a new incarnation. Its latest incarnation it comes through the quote unquote Christian ufology movement, where all they all of a sudden they believe that they certain fringe fundamentalists believe that that the book of Genesis, when it talks about the sons of God and coming down to earth and wedding the daughters of men, that it's talking about the Watchers creating a new race known as the Nephilim, a race of giants, because women and angelic beings are interbreeding, and all of a sudden, and they put this racialist spin on the story and say, well, God sent the flood because the gene pools were getting polluted by all of this interbreeding and so on and so forth, and it bears eerie resemblance to basically Christian identity theology.
But this is a classic myth that we've seen recycled, where imperial myths tend to do this, right? This was part of the Nazi mythos, was the idea of being the race of the gods. We're descended from the gods, the others aren't. And this is where it ties into Darwinism. That's essentially what Darwinian philosophy is, especially in its early days, where it has that Anglo primacy, which was part of even the title of Origin of Species, right? Of the lesser species, the lesser races.
Right.
And it's always the same prepackaged myth.
Yeah. In the case of the Watcher Nephilim UFO narrative, it's something. This interbreeding was evil. It downgraded the race, and led to the flood. And Noah is saved not because he's righteous and because he walks with God, but instead because he merely keeps his gene pool clean,
right,
and everything. And again, this all bears eerie resemblance to Christian identity, and the reason that that's the case is because there is a connection to the very same deep political forces that created Christian identity. The first person to come up with this whole Nephilim eschatology, so far as we could determine, was I.D.E. Thomas, and I.D.E. Thomas was a part of this was a part of a diploma mill that had been set up by William Stort McBurney, who was a conservative talk show host. He started the Voice of Americanism and everything. But what most people don't realize is that McBurney was a member of one of the groups that were set up by John Singlaub that fell under the umbrella of the World Anti-Communist League. And the World Anti-Communist League was supposedly this group that was against, that was fighting to bring about a rollback of Soviet influence in the world and fighting against communism. But what it was, in fact, was really a repository for Nazis, for ex-Nazis, Nazi veterans, that allowed them to continue their work after the war, just doing it on behalf, that work was now being done on behalf of Western intelligence groups.
Well, this is an important point, because we often highlight radical groups being run or set up by intelligence agencies, and we tend to think of Marxism or communist groups or the Frankfurt School. But we can't forget that the so-called far right has all of these same issues.
Right, exactly. And all. Prior to Singlaub coming on with the World Anti-Communist League, it was headed up by an individual by the name of Pierce, who who bragged about his work with the Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele, having associated with him, who did several different tracks in the defense of eugenics. Pierce went on to work with Liberty Lobby's Willis Carto, who was like the foremost face of the extreme right here in the United States, and all. And Carto and started Liberty Lobby, which became a repository for a lot of Christian identity thought. And there's evidence that Carto himself became an adherent to Christian identity and everything. And so when you look at the Nephilim eschatology that's presented, that's promoted by the fringes of fringe fundamentalists within the Christian world, what you're seeing is just merely a new incarnation of Christian identity, and that's very significant because Christian identity has historically been just littered with agent provocateurs.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for instance, McVeigh, Timothy McVeigh.
Yes.
He read the Spotlight. When he was stopped, a Spotlight phone card was also found in the vehicle when he was speeding away from the Oklahoma City bombing. He had been to a Christian identity outpost known as Elohim City, and had worked. And at Elohim City, he had collaborated with an individual known as Andreas Straussmeyer. Well,
yes.
What most people don't know is that Andreas Straussmeyer was on loan to the American government
from German intelligence, right?
Yeah, from German intelligence, and he played his father Gunther was also very instrumental in German reunification, by the way.
You know, I was reading some of the Eric Rudolph as well. I think it was Eric Rudolph I was reading about, either him or Paul Hill. You can find connections of those guys to the Christian identity groups as well. And I think you'll find as well amongst Christian identity groups, they will tie into even Mormon groups they might have a fringe Mormon theology, but they'll be connected to a network that agrees with Christian identity.
Right, absolutely. Well, the funny thing is that the whole Christian identity milieu also connects to groups that we would fancy as being way left of center. One example that I can pull out, extemporaneously off the top of my head, would be Liberty Lobby's ties to Jim Jones's People's Temple. So now we're coming kind of full circle. Mark Lane, who the attorney and former New York legislature, provides the bridge between Jim Jones's People's Temple and Liberty Lobby, because I believe it was in 1985 Lane came to represent Liberty Lobby when its legal counsel just mysteriously disappeared, and Liberty Lobby, basically turned to him for legal consultation to act as legal counsel. And the relationship existed even after this lawsuit that had existed between Liberty Lobby and the National Review. That he was called in to help with this lawsuit between the lobby and the magazine National Review. Christopher Bolin, who is this anti-Semitic journalist who wrote for American Free Press, which was the direct descendant of Liberty Lobby's Spotlight tabloid, has claimed that Lane seized control of Liberty Lobby in 1993.
Hold that thought. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. We're talking to the Collins brothers about radical fringe movement. Esoteric Hollywood. Tonight we're talking about strange movements, cults, exotheology, aliens, UFO films, and propaganda. And we were just discussing with Paul Collins of conspiracyarchive.com the usage of Christian identity movements based around pretty dogmatic racial philosophy and theology. And Paul made me think of, when I was reading about Eric Rudolph, the association with the Church of Israel, formerly known as the Church of Our Heritage, which is one of these split denominations out of the Church of Christ Temple lot of the Latter-day Saint movement, which I would argue pretty clearly looks to be a staged government-run type entity. And you'll notice that they had this belief in the serpent seed doctrine, which was the idea of their founder, Mr. Gaiman.
Right.
The idea that there's a two bloodline seed doctrine, and that some are seed of the serpent, and that's the basis for salvation and living in terms of who you can and cannot marry. And Paul was just telling us about the Liberty Lobby and the strange connections between McVeigh and different groups of these far right movements.
Right, and I just want to correct myself. I said that the individual that preceded Singlob as the head of the World Anti-Communist League was an individual by the name of Pierce. It was actually Roger Pearson. His name was Roger Pearson, and you know, Roger Pearson went on to work with Willis Carto, the head of Liberty Lobby, and Liberty Lobby has this strong connection to Christian identity. Going into the group you brought up, the Church of Israel. Church of Israel, one of its major members is the Green Beret and Vietnam veteran James Bo Grice. Well, he ran on the populist ticket for president.
Oh, yeah, he's one of these Patriot Radio guys. Yeah. Totally clownish, right?
Yeah, well, he ran on the Populist Party ticket back in '88, I think it was, and then '92 again. The Populist Party was founded by Willis Carto and everything. Well, Mark Lane acted as the lawyer for Liberty Lobby.
Oh, wow.
And Christopher Bolin, who had written for American Free Press, which was the publication that descended from Liberty Lobby's Spotlight tabloid, you know, said, hey, you know, this guy has seized control of Liberty Lobby, and he claimed that he seized control of Liberty Lobby in 1993 because the group was coming really close. It was teetering on bankruptcy at the time, and the founder of Criminal Politics magazine, L.T. Patterson, was in some kind of legal dispute with Mark Lane at the time. And he won that legal dispute, but during the course of the lawsuit, Patterson learned that Lane owned Liberty Lobby, and Bolin, you know, he's coming at this whole thing from a very distorted nativist, patriot, populist, optic. So he views Lane as kind of an infiltrant working on behalf of Jewish powers and everything. But, and of course I totally discount that idea. But while his theory concerning Lane is distorted by his anti-Semitism, there might be grounds to be suspicious of Lane, because prior to working with Liberty Lobby as its legal counsel, he provided legal representation to the People's Temple. So again, oh
wow,
yeah. So again, there's the connection of the supposedly far right group to a supposedly far left group, and in both circumstances, the commonality is a tie to intelligence circles.
Well, it's like McVeigh. Who was his psychiatrist? Jolyon West.
Jolyon West.
That's
yes.
unreal. I mean, come on.
Well, the funny thing is that Jolyon West, if I recall correctly, spoke on Patty Hearst's behalf at her trial.
Yes, I've read that. Yes.
Okay. Well, Well, and again, Leo Ryan, the congressman who would visit Jonestown,
Yes.
took an interest in Patty Hearst's case. He wanted to see her sentence commuted. He knew that she had been merely a mind control dupe, and I think that he was also onto things as far as Donald DeFreeze, that he realized that DeFreeze was a mind control dupe as well, because he was trying to shed light on some of these experiments that were going on at the Vacaville prison,
Right.
where DeFreeze became involved with the Black Cultural Association headed up by Colston Westbrook and everything.
Well, this is the pattern that we start to see, is that these kinds of groups will be led by some sort of figure that has these shady ties and connections. And what tends to happen is that it's like they're looking for people to goad into, provocateur, and trap into doing these kinds of things. And this is something I've been looking at in the last several interviews and talks that I've done, is how this is kind of a pattern that you see, whether it's the radical jihad or whether it's these kinds of groups. It's looking for people who can be goaded into some sort of, shooting an abortion clinic or something like this.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. But the thing is that, with people like DeFreeze and Patty Hearst, we see them coming from the same pool of manipulation as Jonestown, because Donald DeFreeze was actually found to have attended Jonestown meetings, and so there was some and Jones was very much supportive of the Symbionese Liberation Army, maybe not openly, but in private at the People's Temple meeting, he expressed his support for them and everything, and so here we have Mark Lane representing this group that's has some kind of intelligence connection back in the 70s before its supposed self-implosion in 78.
Mm-hmm.
And everything, and then later on reemerging again with Liberty Lobby in the 80s and in the 90s, and another, and again also another commonality is not just connections to intelligence groups there with both Liberty Lobby and Jonestown, but also the traces of exotheology as an ingredient of manipulation in both cases, because Liberty Lobby again seems to be a repository of Christian identity. Christian identity made major contributions to ufology, to UFO lore, and in particular ufology in its latest incarnation as the whole Watcher Nephilim UFO theory and the whole Nephilim eschatology that we see in the writings of Chuck Missler, that we see in the writings of I.D.E. Thomas, that we see pushed by groups like former associates of mine, like the Gilberts, Peering into Darkness, pushed by individuals such as Tom Horn and Lynn Marzulli, who both received honorary degrees from I.D.E. Thomas, given the fact that he came from a diploma mill started by William Stuart McBurney. That shows just how much value you can invest in those honorary degrees they have, by the way. What I guess I'm trying to say is that you just see this continuity and you see these common ingredients. You see the manipulative little fingers of criminalized intelligence circles, and you also see exotheological ingredients in each one of these groups acting as a kind of an ingredient for control.
Let me ask you this: how far do you think a lot of this is a centralized agenda, and how far of it is just, say, criminalized portions of the intelligence community that go on to try to run some sort of scam?
that's really hard to determine. It's really hard to determine because in the deep political world you have a lot of different sharks swimming around.
Yeah, right.
And everything. I mean, like it's like, you know, prior to the show we were talking about the Blacklist. Well, in the Blacklist, you know, we have this group that closely resembles what L. Fletcher Prouty was speaking about, known as the secret team, a group that has, you know, people placed in strategic positions in government and in chokeholds in the government and everything. But also you have these people that they're the control over, but you know, you have all these other people that the control over which is more precarious, that you know that appears on Raymond Reddington's Blacklist. You know,
yes,
more
right.
They're not necessarily lone nuts, but they provide their services to different factions.
Right, they're sort of a privatized for hire kind of guy.
Yeah. So it's almost a mixture of the secret team concept put out there that was put out by L. Fletcher Prouty, and the idea of deep politics that has been presented by Peter Dale Scott. You know, the idea that look, there's a sub rosa level to all of this, and it's just it's a subculture, you know, instead of some monolithic thing. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint any kind of like centralized, you know, control.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back in just a minute. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and we're talking to Paul Collins of ConspiracyArchive.com. Hollywood, we're having a fascinating conversation with Paul Collins of ConspiracyArchive.com. The book is Invoking the Beyond and will be out. So do you have a date yet at all? When that'll be out?
We're hoping, you know, last time we spoke, we were telling you sometime this year and like now I want to say sometime next year, but I mean, like we're bringing like the major connective sinews kind of are in place now.
Yeah.
And everything. And so I feel that it should be done next year, but I don't want to make any guarantees and everything. You know, it's just reached that point where it'll be done when it's done.
Right.
And everything. What I'll say is what was skeletal last year is now more fleshy and all this year and everything. There has been
you've done your Anunnaki DNA tweaking on it.
There you go. Yeah.
Giving it some limbs now. All right, we're talking before the break about Blacklist, which is a show that I have watched the first couple seasons of, and it's very fascinating in terms of how it seems to parallel quite a few real world scenarios. And I was glad that Paul mentioned Blacklist because I was thinking that I did need to eventually do a show that dealt with it. Now, in this series, James Spader is playing Raymond Reddington.
Right.
And Reddington is this sort of, well, at the beginning of the show, he's wanted and then he's brought in and he's, you know, gives himself up, and he's doing this because he kind of knows the dirt on the global crime syndicates that are all the global criminal networks. And then so his bargaining chip is that he's working with the FBI in the West, in the U.S., to nail all the bad guys. Now, that's a little bit Hollywood, but what is interesting is that each one of these episodes, as far as I've seen, does seemed to parallel some pretty real-world black operations, covert operations, criminal networks, mafia syndicates, even human trafficking in one episode.
Right. I think that actually was the second episode that dealt with human trafficking and everything. But by the second season, you start to see that these supposedly unrelated cases that he's bringing to them actually do have, a common thread running throughout them. And what you've basically learned is that he's trying to bring down this what is called the cabal and everything. Right. And the cabal is basically made of intelligence operatives and politicians that have chokeholds on every point of the government and have basically evolved into a shadow government. And they call it a shadow government in there. It really bears eerie resemblance to what the deceased journalist Danny Casolaro called the octopus and everything.
This is the plot of the newest Bond film, Spectre.
Right, absolutely. I haven't had a chance yet, but I really want to see that one because it looks like it takes us back to Quantum of Solace, where they first started to develop that idea.
It does, correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, but Raymond Reddington, I'm almost certain that the writers of the show are drawing from real life individuals.
Yes.
In putting together the character of Reddington, who James Spader does a really great job portraying. But he's a composite of several different people. But the one that I thought, in my personal opinion, he comes closest to reflecting a real life individual was Edwin Wilson and everything, because Raymond Reddington is former naval intelligence. Well, Wilson worked naval intelligence. He started with the CIA. He is fired, quote unquote, by the CIA. He goes to work for Task Force 157, which is this joint naval intelligence NSA group and everything, that's actually spying on Henry Kissinger on behalf of Thomas More and everything.
Wow.
What it was that More was just frustrated because of Kissinger's reluctance to share anything with him. It's like he's here. What? I'm the head of naval operations. You should be disclosing this stuff to me concerning your diplomacy with communist China and everything. If I remember correctly, Thomas More was no fan of communist China. If I remember correctly, he was the first to suggest that the United States start mining Haiphong Harbor to keep the Soviets and the Chinese from bringing in weapons to the North Vietnamese and everything. And so, he was using Task Force 157 to spy on Kissinger, and Ted Shackley and his deputy Tom Clines were like, well, wouldn't it be great if we could get in on this action? So they had Edwin Wilson supposedly, leave the agency and go to work in Task Force 157. And what he's really doing was he was really passing back intel to Shackley and Clines and everything, so everybody was basically using everybody and everything, Wilson was set up. He was made to look like some kind of rogue, some kind of lone wolf kind of rogue individual.
Yeah.
And everything.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next, was how rogue is it really? It's hilarious because
in 1983, he always held that he was still working for the CIA when he was doing business with the Libyans, and when he was dealing weapons and everything. In 1983, evidence emerged that actually supported what he said. It vindicated what he said. The CIA had a new inspector general at that time, James H. Taylor, and Taylor said, "Hey, it's almost impossible to compile a complete list of Wilson's official or quasi-official contacts with the CIA since 1971, because if you were going to do this, you would have to research approximately 3 safe drawers of data and everything." And Taylor found that after early 1971, Wilson had at least 80 additional instances of where he had non-social contact with the CIA and everything, and that fell within the time frame when he was doing his dealings with the Libyans and everything. And the evidence was so overwhelming that finally his conviction was overturned in 2003 and everything. I mean, it was after 20 years of incarceration and everything. But I'm starting to think that we're heading towards some similar narrative developing with the character of Raymond Reddington. Okay. That he's been portrayed as this rogue, but the reason that he's starting to out this blacklist is basically say, listen, guys, I'm not so rogue after all. Actually, I was a part of the power structure, and they tried to cut me loose and use me as a sacrificial lamb.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah. You bring me down, I'm going to bring you down.
Yeah, exactly. Mutually assured destruction, kind of like what we saw at the end of the International, where the head of the bank is talking to the Turkish arms dealer, and he says, "Well, how can I trust you?" Well, and he's like, "Trust is not going to be the glue or the adhesive of our relationship. It's going to be the fact that we could both screw one another. Exactly. We'll impale ourselves on a double-edged sword." Oh, wow. Yeah. And everything. But the funny thing is that when you're looking at characters like Wilson, you actually have ties back into the whole UFO phenomena, because I mean, if you look at the individual Robert Lazar, who was a computer tech guy that basically was the first to bring out all these stories about Area 51. Mm-hmm. He claims that he got his job with EG&G, the contractors that worked out at Area 51, on a recommendation that came from Edward Teller, the individual who created created the hydrogen bomb. Edward Teller was, basically a member of what has been described as the secret right and everything. The hidden right is what Goodchild referred to it as, which is a different network of different groups. It's just basically this network of groups working within the right wing of the American political spectrum. Groups with lots of intelligence ties. One of those groups was the CMP, the Council for National Policy.
Well, hold that thought. We're going to have to take a break. Sure. We're back in just. Esoteric Hollywood. Tonight, my guest is Paul Collins of conspiracyarchive.com. We were just talking about more deep state covert operations, and how the show Blacklist, I believe NBC's Blacklist, very much parallels the lives of Edwin Wilson and the shady dealings he was involved in. And Paul, you were just talking about, you were making some more connections here with the CNP.
Yeah. Teller was a member of the CNP. He had been on the Board of Governors back in '82. Another member of the CNP, one who had been at the inaugural meeting in '81, was Richard Viguerie. And Viguerie is this direct mail entrepreneur and moral majority founder and all. He's very influential in the CNP circles. But Viguerie was a member of the Georgetown Club, which was an operation that was set up by the South Korean lobbyist and intelligence agent Tung Sung Park, basically to blackmail congressmen so that they would not pull their support for South Korea. Park had rescued the Georgetown Club when it was almost going under. It was going bankrupt, and he did that with the assistance of a Republican activist and now a known homosexual who's since died, who was with Hill and Knowlton, Robert Keith Gray, and Gray became the president, the first president of Georgetown Club. But Robert Keith Gray also worked for Edwin Wilson, and Georgetown Club became a place where, according to Wilson's partner Fred Turple, and all, Wilson was basically running a blackmail, a sexual entrapment ring, where basically these influential individuals would come in and have relationships with these prostitutes and be filmed and everything. So here Lazar is now falling into this milieu, and it's really funny to learn later on that Lazar in 1990 this was following his revelations concerning Area 51. He was found guilty on a felony charge of pandering. He had been recruited by a well-known local prostitute, and he had been encouraged to solicit her customers, and her name was Tony Bullock, and she received help from Lazar in establishing her business and modernizing her outfit's computers. But what was most startling that we found when we were doing our research, and this is all going to appear in the book, was the fact that Lazar had kept computer records of Bullock's customers. A police investigation discovered that Lazar had actually videotaped customers and maintained records of their license plates when they were coming and going.
Well, naturally.
And everything. So Lazar, it looks like, took the fall for Bullock, and so that Bullock, it would not be outed in court that Bullock was working for local law enforcement and probably other forces, because she was just very powerful within the Las Vegas prostitution scene and seemed to have this kind of immunity.
Yeah.
Well,
that's what I was actually going to ask you next about. I don't mean to change the subject, but it makes me think of Heidi Fleiss. And you remember how that was turned into a movie? I mean, it just became this whole thing back in the 90s. And it makes you wonder how much that was, not staged or planned.
Right. Absolutely. And there's, like you say, there's just more parallels there that for the person to unpack and everything. Bullock, she was working as an informant for like the FBI, the DEA, Las Vegas Metro, and everything. She was allowed to continue doing this as long as she didn't do outcalls to the hotels and everything. And God only knows what was going on at the hotels and who they were trying to protect that were at the hotels and everything. But you see this this overlap now between the UFO community, UFO lore, and actual intelligence-connected sexual entrapment and blackmail rings.
There we go. Yes.
Yeah, leading into to the likes of Edwin Wilson, leading all the way back. Actually, in the book, we take it all the way back to Roy Cohn, who was the counsel to
McCarthy.
To McCarthy, yeah, and I did some extensive. Well, I did like 2 interviews with former NYPD detective James Rothstein about his experiences with Cohn and what Roy Cohn had told him and everything about these entrapment about these entrapment schemes. But one of the funny things that it's not funny, but one of the things that that Jimmy told me when I was doing the interviews with him, that was that the Watergate burglars had actually broke into Watergate looking for what was called the quote unquote pedophile book, which included basically a book. Which basically it was a book that listed all these different politicians that were involved in pedophilia, and I remember Jimmy was like, "Can you imagine the power that G. Gordon Liddy would have had if he had that book in his hands?"
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We hear about the Clintons being in control of a lot of these files and able to blackmail a lot of politicians in D.C. and things like that. And we start thinking about it from that perspective, you really start to get a handle on how D.C. and all this really works. And I talked to a friend of mine who's very knowledgeable, talking about how it's the same way in Vegas, where potentially what happens is, like with Heidi Fleiss or the D.C. Madam, is that it's the Madam who will have the connections to the government or the intelligence agencies, and thus you have the blackmail. Right.
But the funny thing is that, Jimmy, pondered just what kind of power G. Gordon Liddy would have if he had that book in his hands. And G. Gordon Liddy, of course, was, the organizer and the one that conducted the Watergate burglary. And so you have this connection of G. Gordon Liddy to the whole intelligence, sexual entrapment, blackmail milieu. But you then also have a connection between G. Gordon Liddy and the UFO milieu, because John Lear, who was Robert Lazar's friend and associate, the former Air America pilot, who actually encouraged Lazar to go public with his revelations concerning Area 51. He actually has, and you can go to his website and see this, an autographed picture of him standing with Liddy, with G. Gordon Liddy, and it's the picture's dated 1986, and the picture's autograph reads, quote, "John, I told them effing nothing." I'll leave out the expletive. "I told them effing nothing. G. Gordon Liddy." So you can't help but wonder if Liddy was boasting to Lear about refusing to share secrets that included, among other things, plans to control politicians using the infamous pedophile book, But, here, we have John Lear know somebody that was involved in the whole sexual entrapment and blackmail milieu, and then his friend and associate, Robert Lazar, falls into sexual blackmail, sexual blackmail and entrapment milieu after making his revelations about Area 51 and everything. So, we in all of this we go into in the book, and
right.
Just this continual overlap that suggests that the whole of UFO lore is a complete scam, a complete manipulation, yes, and everything meant to direct people in a desired direction and everything, a direction desired by the elite, and which Well, which factions of the elite? Well, there it just seems that there's several different factions that profit from spreading this myth. There's the Atlanticists, the Atlanticist. We see their fingers in it through people like Rockefeller and through the Rockefeller dynasty and their financing of the Princeton Radio Project under Hadley Cantrell. Looking into mass panic and to fear and anxiety created by War of the Worlds, or we also see it with the Southern Rim, with with people from the Southern Rim like Hunt, who financed the CMP, was a major mover and shaker in the CMP and the John Birch Society. We see both. We see both of those factions with their fingers in the pie.
I want to ask you. We're going to have a break here in a second, but when we get back, I want to talk some more about the alien mythos and Hollywood in our final segment. But if you're looking for organic supplements, and it's getting close to the holiday season, so certainly you're going to want to transition over to organic food and supplements, and I would recommend not going to Walgreens and Walmart. Instead, go to j.talknetwork.com, and there you'll find all kinds of organic supplements and products that have been tested to make sure that they're not GMO. And I would also recommend going to conspiracyarchive.com and checking out all the awesome articles that the Collins brothers have there. And you'll spend quite a bit of time reading. I know I have over the years. And definitely check out JaysAnalysis.com. When we come back, we'll conclude with Paul Collins. Esoteric Hollywood, final segment. Paul, you've dropped so many knowledge bombs on us tonight. It's going to be definitely a talk that people are going to have to listen to 3 or 4 times and take notes. I know that I have been as we've been talking. Tell us, what do you think about NASA? This is just one speculation I've had. I don't really think that the elites are that concerned with finding space brothers. I think that, as we've said, it's a convenient mythology that can be co-opted for various reasons: geopolitical, socio-political, religious, syncretistic, and so forth. But when I look at things like SETI and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and I see millions and millions of dollars put into big satellite networks and so forth, I would speculate that that probably has to do with surveillance, and maybe aliens are the cover for that kind of stuff. What do you think about NASA and SETI and these kinds of things? What would you say to somebody who said, "Well, look, they've got all these search for intelligent extraterrestrial life satellites. They're actually interested in finding aliens out there."
Yeah, I think that the whole alien narrative has kind of a dual use to it. It helps in the realm of social engineering because it helps the elite to basically construct new systems of belief that act as forms of control. It's kind of a new control software, if you will.
Well, but what about NASA, though? I mean, NASA, they've discovered life on other planets many times.
Yeah, but
every few months.
Yeah, but I also think that that aliens are used, as cover, as disinformation to cover things like that. It's used for social engineering, but the whole myth is used to cover things such as surveillance. I know that in in the manuscript as it stands right now, one of the re-emerging things over and over and over again is the overlap between UFO disinformation, alien disinformation, and the drug trade. and everything. I think my personal opinion, and it's been hard for me to articulate this over time, but but I'll give it my best shot. I think that NASA is supposed to provide cover for. It's my personal opinion.
Yep.
It's supposed to provide cover for secret space programs. There's not just one. There's several for programs such as those that are set up by Robert Bigelow, who started NITSE with a lot of different intelligence assets and everything. I think that NASA is also supposed to play a social engineering role, because if you hear the way that I remember that one individual at Mission Control during the early days of when people were still just transfixed whenever they were launching something. I mean, like people nowadays, it's like big wow.
Nobody cares, right?
Yeah, nobody gives a hoot, But I remember that one of the individuals was asked why it was so important that they were doing this. He said, well, as Arthur C. Clarke pointed out, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke he was citing, either that or Asimov. He said, the race for space, accomplishing space travel and basically establishing humanity among the stars is the most important development since humanity created religion. So it's obvious, so it's obvious again that NASA is supposed to help make this idea of colonizing space, of reaching out and making contact with other civilizations, a new repository for man's spiritual experience that's supposed to supplant the orthodox religions of the world.
What do you think? What do you think SETI is for?
I do think that SETI probably plays a role as far as surveillance is concerned and everything. But I think that if you want to look at the ultimate, if you want to look at the ultimate agenda behind NASA, you have to look at what von Braun, Werner von Braun, who worked for NASA, who was a Nazi scientist prior to all this. He killed a lot of people at Peenemünde, constructing those V-1 flying bombers and the V-2 ballistic missiles. He used slave labor, and he made no bones about that. Both he and Dornberger knew that that's what they were using, and he acquired laborers from Buchenwald concentration camp. So how could he not know, and everything? But in 2001, he supposedly told Dr. Carol Rosen, who was the first female corporate manager of Fairchild Industries. He went to work for Fairchild Industries following his work for NASA, that aliens were going to that they were part of a control agenda. They were the final scare tactic.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about that quote, right?
Yeah. I mean, like he said that that first the Russians were going to be considered to be the enemy, and everything, and that they had killer satellites, and that they were going to try to control us, and so he invoked. First there was going to be the invocation of the Red Scare, then it was going to be terrorist and everything, and third world crazies, rogue states, pariah nations, and then the final one would be extraterrestrials. And all of these enemies, all of these terrors, all of these nightmares were being invoked to basically get us to build space-based weapons and everything. And space-based weapons, of course, would be the ultimate means of control, because you can use them. I mean, it would play right into the hands of world government if there was I know how this sounds. This sounds crazy, but if
Well,
there
it sounds
was
perfectly logical to me. I think it's perfect.
if the nation states cease to be nation states and become merely provinces,
Yes.
and you have a recalcitrant province and all, why don't you just meld it down with a bunch of SDI technology? You know, or scare them back into submission by merely the threat of
Yeah,
using.
that's exactly right. I don't want to ruin it for you, but wait until you see Spectre. You'll find out that the basically the G8, G9 is co-opting themselves into a big, huge surveillance octopus, which is secretly Spectre, that will keep everyone safe from any potential threats, be they, well, in the film, of course, it's not aliens, it's all terror based. But you'll find a curious scene towards the end with Blofeld when he makes it explicit with his discussion of a meteorite, the external threat of invoking the beyond.
Right. Well, all that von Braun was doing when he said these things to Rosen was invoking the beyond. He was presenting different things that at one point or another was a new incarnation of the beyond, something that just totally dwarfed us epistemologically speaking,
Yeah.
and that just was forcing us to abandon, our conventional politics, everything, and invite in this new, more totalitarian
Everything
model.
must change. Everything must, because we're all in a state of perpetual flux, evolution, process, philosophy. Everything must change into the reorganization of all of society, and this is where even Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, these Club of Rome, all of this fits into this notion of sustainability, because everything, it's a perpetual crisis. Everything has to be reorganized.
Right, absolutely. Space-based weapons, though, they're basically supposed to take the place of nuclear weapons as a form of the beyond, and as kind of a salvific vehicle for humanity. Because, in the book we're going to go into this informal kind of cult of the super weapon that exists among the elites, that
Yes.
basically a super weapon, whether it be the nuclear bomb or the hydrogen bomb or a space-based kind of weapon, is the way of introducing utopia, because finally the world government will have that instrument of coercion that it needs to impose peace upon all of humanity. All of humanity will give itself unto the world government out of fear of nuclear extinction or extinction at the hands of space-based weapons. Long way
Yes,
around.
we'll have some sort of contrived threat of the weaponry owned by Axis/BRIC nations or something, and if only we would all join under the banner of the UN, we could finally have global peace.
Right, absolutely, and all. But I didn't know that those that those elements were in the Spectre that you just told me. I don't want you to give it totally. I don't want to sit here, and it's 84 or 83, and it's like, oh, thanks a lot. I didn't know that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's. I haven't seen Empire yet. Thanks a bunch for But yeah, that is fascinating, and that makes me want to see it even more.
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward false flag scenario type plot where Spectre is basically co-opting all the intelligence agencies and their surveillance and any nation that doesn't go along gets a terror attack. Really? So, all right. Well, this has been a great interview, and I want to thank you, Paul. And be sure and check out their new book coming out, Invoking the Beyond and Conspiracy Archive.